Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm James Shaheen, Tricycle's editor-in-chief. I'm here today with members of Buddhist Justice Reporter, or BJR, a group of academics, writers, and legal professionals committed to bringing a Buddhist perspective to the recent trial for the murder of George Floyd, and also to the issues of racial justice and police brutality in the United States. We have partnered with BJR, who have covered the trial. You can check out their coverage at tricycle.org/BJR. For those who can't make it, this is being recorded and will appear on our YouTube channel. The link is in the chat. Okay, so now for our guests. Teware Sala is a guiding teacher at the Seattle Meditation Society and the founding teacher of the Capitol Hill Meditation Group. She's a retired prosecuting attorney who has practiced Vipassana meditation for over 30 years. Teware believes that urban meditation is the foundation for today's practitioners' path to liberation. She's inspired by bringing the Dharma to non-traditional places and is a strong advocate for practitioners living with high stress, past trauma, and difficulties sitting still. That's all of us, I think. Teware has been teaching since 2010 and has a long history of assisting others in establishing and maintaining a daily practice. So welcome, Teware.
Thank you.
Tara Moulay is an insight meditation teacher and a criminal defense appellate attorney with 23 years experience practicing law. She has been trained and authorized by Insight Meditation Society to teach. Her Dharma offerings stem from the lineage of Mahasi Sayadaw. She serves on the board of directors of Insight World Aid. She believes classical Buddhist practices designed to cultivate compassion, non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion are uniquely potent vehicles for empowering people in marginalized communities and affecting social change. So welcome, Tara.
Thanks, James.
Shannon Gibney is a writer, educator, activist, and the author of See No Color and Dream Country. One is from Carol Rhoda Lab and the other from Dutton in 2018. Both are Minnesota Book Award winning novels. She has been part of the Common Ground Meditation Center and other BIPOC Sanghas in the Twin Cities for 15 years. Welcome, Shannon.
Thank you so much for having us.
It's a pleasure to have you. So please note that please post your questions. If you have any questions, put them in the Q&A tab at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to as many of them as we can before the session ends. This is an hour-long session, and as questions come in, I'll go ahead and present them to our panel. So to start, Shannon, I'd just like to hear about what BJR is, Buddhist Justice Reporter, and what its goals are.
Yeah, so BJR comes out of the Order of Freedom Sangha, which is a new Sangha that was the brainchild, the brilliant Pamela Ayatinde, who is a community Dharma practitioner and one of the co-editors of the new book, Black and Buddhist, which I encourage everyone to check out. And she sent out a communique to a bunch of us, a bunch of folks. She's very well connected, knows some amazing people. And basically what she said was, I have been changed profoundly by the experience of watching this video of the murder of George Floyd. And I can no longer practice. I want to explore practicing the Dharma in different ways, in different capacities relative to the trials of these police officers that were involved in this murder. And so she asked folks, BIPOC folks, if they would be interested in forming this new Sangha. And so right now there's about 10 of us, not exclusively in the Twin Cities, but most of us are in the Twin Cities. And then we have kind of affiliate members like Tara and Tuere. I'm sorry, I completely butchered your name. Say it for me again. I hate it when I do this, but
that's cool. It's Tuere. So it's this thing is Tu, Air, and Ray.
Okay, Tuere. So we have an amazing BJR legal team as well that helps us sort of analyze what we're doing, and they've also written some amazing pieces. So yeah, so it's been, time is flying. So maybe almost a year, I want to say, that we have been gathering and sort of getting to know each other. And Io had this idea of this Buddhist Justice Reporter, where we act as witnesses in various capacities in relationship to the violence of this act, in relationship to the ongoing historical violence against Black people in the United States that is just further exacerbated and represented by these trials. And that we explore it specifically through this kind of emerging term that we call Buddhist justice framework. You know, justice is not necessarily something that we hear a lot in relationship to at least Western Buddhism, and so, but it is in terms of Black people's and people of colors, BIPOC folks' freedom struggles here in the United States. So we want to explore what that means, and we're not necessarily sure what that means, but we feel that it's a productive space of discovery and not knowing. And so we're writing pieces. A bunch of us are writers, a bunch of us are teachers and academics. As I said before, a bunch of us are lawyers. So we've been also writing pieces that Tricycle has been generous enough to publish through their platforms on various aspects of, sorry, I have a dog downstairs and some kids. I'm sure many of you can relate. Yeah, so we've been writing all kinds of different pieces through Tricycle, exploring this nascent concept of Buddhist justice framework and how that might apply. We also have, we have amazing partners. So we partnered with Common Ground Meditation Center in Minneapolis, and Stacy McClendon, who's one of the teachers there, leaders there. She has been working with IO to ask Dharma teachers of African descent to lead a weekly vigil during the trials. So that's another component. And we're just, you know, what I appreciate in our approach is that we're sitting in it. We don't have a set destination, but we want to use our understanding of the Dharma and our skills and our particular orientation as BIPOC in this particular moment to experience and really feel everything that there's here to feel.
Well, thank you, Shannon. The generosity works both ways, of course. You've given very insightful analysis. So let's go to the verdict, last Tuesday's verdict. I just want to say, quote Minnesota's Attorney General, who said, "It's not justice, it's accountability," which maybe a lot of people didn't understand at first. He did expound on that a bit. He considered accountability the first step toward justice, a very long journey toward justice. So I was wondering if each of you could say something about that. Tara, do you want to begin?
Sure, I'll say a few things. I think that, you know, Keith Ellison did expound on that a little and pointed to the fact that this is just one case. Justice would look like a completely different set of conditions for Black and brown people in the United States, where, for example, from the get-go, you know, in just taking the George Floyd murder as an example, the officer started the interaction by coming at him with a pulled gun. And so that was, you know, what we call a felony stop. And a lot of conditions led to that approach to an African-American man who had simply allegedly used a $20 counterfeit bill. And so the entire system is really impacted by white supremacy in terms of from the way that African Americans have to interact with the criminal justice system, the laws and how they're you know, the laws and how they function, you know, the court system. You can see it if you look at the entire trial. You can see the way that the description of what happened you know, the prosecutor was trying to change the conditions around this, was trying to convince people that actually the officer, Derek Chauvin, should have had compassion for George Floyd. And that's not actually the approach that in the United States that we've had towards African-American, in particular, people who are before and after and during being detained by the police. So justice would look like a completely different system. Justice would look like a system that African-Americans could actually, to a large extent, trust. And we know we're really, really far from that, very far from that.
Tuere?
Yeah, I think I agree similarly. If we're looking at it from the perspective of African Americans and Black and brown skinned people in general, I think this is a step towards, it's like a step of accountability, and it's a step towards justice in the long run. But if you look at it for George Floyd's family and the people directly related to him, I think they probably feel a sense of justice having come their way. And that's part of the problem, because it's so random who gets justice and who doesn't, which family feels whole and which family doesn't. And there's no, without what Tara was pointing to, this broader change in the perspective and the way we deal with the way the police approach Black and brown skinned people. I'm speaking mostly of Black people. Until the police change the way they approach us in general, then some people get a sense of justice and some people don't. And this is just that one step of accountability towards that changing. That's what I think.
Shannon?
Yeah, I also want to say that this case was so particular and so abnormal, because we did not, when we say the prosecution, one of our members who is a defense attorney, Camille Bryant, she made sure to tell me that I specify in this talk that this was a special prosecution. This was a special, so this was not Mike Freeman, who is our erstwhile notorious city attorney, or county attorney, I guess I should say, who had sort of gone along with the first police report, which said that there was like no criminal, there was nothing wrong, basically. The police did nothing wrong. And he was not going to do anything. And so then there was, you know, all this uprising, and people were like, no, you have to give it to Keith Ellison. And that was a whole thing, right? Appealing to our governor, Tim Walz, because he's the one that had the authority to make that decision. And then Keith Ellison, once that happened, which there was no guarantee that that was going to happen, let's be clear, like then he had to get this like A-team of amazing prosecutors together. I think there were 4 for this case. And then now we have, right, during this trial of Chauvin, another killing of a Black man, Dante Wright, in Brooklyn Center, which is a suburb, northern suburb of Minneapolis. And the mayor there is saying that he also wants this to go to a special prosecutor. He doesn't want it to go through the normal channels because people don't trust our system, right, at all. So I mean, it just goes to show you the how many different levels there are to this. And all of us, I know this was like a trial that people were listening to across the country, people were listening to across the world. But I just want to say, for specifically BIPOC folks, and yeah, I know a lot of like white allies and whatever, I mean, it was like we were listening with bated breath. Like there was no guarantee that, I mean, we were all crying with the like guilty, 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 because it has literally never happened this way, you know, and nobody. So I just kind of want to, I just, you know, that's not to say that there's not energy to change things, and that as Buddhists, we know things are always changing, but the system itself is doing what it was created to do. And that is to surveil, violate, and destroy Black bodies.
Can I respond to Shannon for just a moment?
Of course.
Because I think sometimes we have to be careful if we make something seem like it's too isolated. And I do agree, listening to all of what I listened to in this trial, it was great to hear the articulation the way it was. What I think we heard was not so much only George Floyd's situation could this happen in. I just think George Floyd's situation was the case that gave us the ability to speak what I think you're going to hear more and more and more and more and more. Because it's almost like it's the nature of human existence. We get habitual, and people began to be habitual, and it's very hard to see outside of a system. So then George Floyd came along. I'm certain Derek Chauvin did not think anybody was going to make a big deal about his behavior, just the cockiness of the way he was. So everybody's operating as this is ordinary life, same old, nothing to see here. And because this matter, and I do think it came from the activists that really pushed that energy, and it got pulled outside of the norm, I wouldn't say that this is just this norm. I think it set a new norm in motion. And I don't think this will be the first time we hear these arguments. I do not think prosecutors will. I do think police departments all over the country are going to have to reevaluate what their mission statements say, because the way it will be used against them in the future will be very different. So I don't necessarily think this is pigeonholed around just these circumstances, as much as I think this was unique enough to pull it outside of habit. And now we can see things more clearly. But I think you'll see this, I think you'll see the same process more and more and more going forward.
So in other words, it's possibly something to build on?
Yeah, that's what I think is going to end up happening. It's going to be built upon rather than, I think police departments may want to try to isolate it. Oh, it's just that particular situation, but it doesn't involve the rest of us. But I think that goes to why the officer that shot Dante Wright was, the whole process was much quicker. I just think we're not in the same environment. So yes, there is still this rolling killing that's going on. Even when the verdict is coming down, the little girl gets killed. There's this rolling energy that's still happening, but we are not in the same world pre-George Floyd. And so how it shakes out is very different than I think it has been in the past.
Can I just add a couple of other?
Of course.
I think that's true, that there's going to be incremental change, but very, very important change. We're already seeing the shift in the way the videos are coming out much faster. I think Rahm Emanuel in Chicago, hit a video for a year, and now we're seeing when these shootings happen, the police departments are putting out the body cam footage really quickly. That is really a huge shift.
Yeah.
A huge shift, and it really speaks to the importance of bearing witness, because and this is all coming from the activism. It's all coming from the previous, people really being activists. So they're changing the conditions. They're changing the way that the authorities need to respond, slowly but surely. I mean, the killings are still happening, right? And so many other injustices are happening, but there is already a noticeable shift.
Yeah.
Shannon, did you have anything to add?
No, I'm okay. That's all right.
Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about your relationship, the relationship between your professional lives and your Buddhist practice. And Teware, I can begin with you. Hello there.
Yeah.
I can begin with you. A two-part question. One, was there a tension between your Buddhist practice and your role as a prosecutor? And two, how did your Buddhist practice change your view, if it did, of the defendant?
I think I personally was so grateful for practice, because as a prosecutor, you carry so much burden. It feels like the weight is on your shoulders for any victim or any harm that happens, or communities where crime happens. And so being a Buddhist actually helped me hold that weight. So we learn how to be with tension and be with dukkha as an ongoing basis. And so I think the practice is what helped me be in trials, hold the weight of that responsibilities, and just go through situations where you can't control the outcome. You can't control the outcome. It's just basically that. So what it did do, though, is it did change my relationship with defendants. So I think when I came into the system, there were clear good guys and clear bad guys. So defendants are the bad guys, prosecutors are the good guys, and that's it. I just didn't have a lot of gray room in there about why someone would be a bad guy. It was just bad guys, good guys. And the more I practiced, the more I could begin to understand all of it. So I could understand someone's criminal behavior given the circumstances that it came out of. So I think it didn't change I didn't not want to be a prosecutor because of the practice, but I did get a sense that I was prosecuting conduct and not people. And so the more I began to see that I was prosecuting conduct, the more I could see these as human beings, even if their conduct was way over the top and I thought warranted, jail time or permanent jail time. Still, they were human beings. And I think that's what the prosecution brought out in Derek Chauvin's trial, is that never did Derek Chauvin ever see George Floyd as a human being. And it never was about the conduct. And so without that, it's hard to be fair and just in your behavior.
That's powerful. I wonder, Tara, you're a criminal defense attorney, and I suppose after getting a law degree from Stanford, you could have gone in a lot of different directions. And I'm wondering, the legal system isn't easy. How has Buddhist practice impacted your legal practice as an attorney, or anything about how Buddhism relates to what you do professionally?
So I'm somewhat of a former attorney for the last few months. I haven't really been an attorney, practicing attorney so much anymore. So it has you know, for me, you know, I wanted to do something meaningful after law school. And I was very, very drawn to criminal defense. I wanted to, particularly, I did indigent criminal defense all my career. You know, kind of a public defender on appeal kind of job. And for me, the practice helped me to hold the stresses and hold the anguish, quite frankly. There was a lot of anguish in my work. I was, at one point, I was representing someone who was sentenced to life in prison, a Black man in California for stealing some razor blades and some aspirin from Rite Aid under the 3 strikes law. I, you know, represented, you know, multiple people who were sentenced to life in prison under the felony murder rule, non-shooters, non-killers, people I really thought their culpability did not warrant in any way a life sentence. And I knew from my interactions with these clients, I saw all of the beauty that they could bring to the world and had, and saw the lives wasted and many other difficulties. And so what my practice did was allow me to practice moment to moment with wanting things to be different than the way they were, and show up as well as I could for the clients without letting that overwhelm me. So it really helped with equanimity in the practice, really helped with equanimity. And therefore with the energy that I could bring to representing people.
Thank you. It's amazing to be put away for life for that. I mean, we forget, but that's what happens, you know. And I guess
I couldn't get him out. I couldn't get him out.
It's heartbreaking. Shannon, you're a writer and you're in the eye of the storm. You're in the Twin Cities. You've seen this all happen up close and personal. How has your Buddhist practice gotten you through this, if it has?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we always talk about the fruits of the practice, and I think just knowing that the seed is always there, and it is this powerful act of secluding the mind. Yeah, so actually doing the practice and then knowing that the practice is there just really helps me in the ways that both Tara and Tuere were talking about, in terms of being able to show up and be present. You know, it's always easier to sort of talk in this sort of guru way of, you know, or write about it of, you know, being non-reactive or not as reactive. And that's, of course, the challenge is in real life to actually not be as reactive and not be as stressed, and to kind of give yourself and other people kind of more space before you just instantly like pounce, you know, which just myself too, my sort of personality, like I'm type A, I'm much more, you know, kind of that way anyway. So I think, yeah, just kind of like the dailiness of the practice for me is incredibly grounding, in especially in difficult moments. I think the Sangha of, for me, particularly the BGR, has been also very activating in a positive way, Layla, because we don't of course know if our actions are leading to any positive fruits, but yet it feels very wholesome to do them. And it does feel like, to what Tuere was saying, you know, we had Fernando Castile killed by police in 2016. We have George Floyd, and before Fernando Castile, there's Jamar Clark, and you know, and people, and there was a ton of activism and outpouring for all of those, and it does feel like, I agree with what both of them were saying, it does feel like we are in a different place. If it's a spiral, we're on a different place in the spiral now, where people weren't saying a year ago, for example, this phrase defunding the police, that was not in sort of public discourse. And that was, people were talking about, we can reform the police, we can do this. And there's plenty of people who still believe that. I'm not one of them. But there's just more and more people, especially looking at the roots of policing, who don't believe that that's true.
Thank you. And I have a dog too, so I certainly understand. He decides when he makes noise. I've heard from BJR members about bearing witness, and sometimes that may sound passive to people, to bear witness. So I understand why they might think that. I think it's a mistake. Do any of you want to talk about what that means to you, bearing witness?
You want to go, Tar?
I can say a little.
All right, I'll go after you.
Okay. I think, an example of bearing witness is BJR, an example of bearing witness is videotaping the kinds of things that happened for example, with the George Floyd murder and torture. And so this can be hugely impactful, bearing witness. It's about exalting voices that otherwise wouldn't be heard and telling the world stories that otherwise were not being told. They're happening. And so it's also, the inherent in that is giving respect and trying to make change. So trying to change the system over time. And as various panelists have said, that's actually, we can see that happening to some degree before our eyes. But bearing witness is not turning away, finally, and not silencing, finally. So I'll just let the other panelists weigh in.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing, Tara. I think bearing witness, the reason why it's so important is because the most painful thing, even as practitioners, we know, is staying with the difficult, being with suffering. We will do anything to keep from being with suffering. And I think before George Floyd, that's what happened. The world would see these videos and poof, move on to the next one, poof, just moving on. It was just this random kind of, I think BIPOC people were probably getting weighted down, and many allies were getting weighted down by the constant videos that were coming out and this sense of a heaviness that you're carrying with you. But in the world at large, there was not this sense of bearing witness to what was happening. It felt like you had to keep yelling and saying, can you guys not see something going on here? But after George Floyd, for some reason, I don't know why it was George Floyd. I couldn't tell you. It's like, why was it Rosa Parks? I mean, many people refused to get off the bus or go to the back or got arrested. But for some reason, in that moment, Rosa Parks made a difference. And somehow she electrified the whole world. And the same was for George Floyd. He represented this suffering and anguish that Tara's talking about to a point where people could bear witness to it, meaning that we could bear the pain of it for the entire process until it was resolved. And that's what, once you start bearing witness, then your ability to actually make change and ability for liberation actually happens, because it starts with recognizing their suffering. And I think before George Floyd, I don't know how much of the world saw how much suffering was going on. There was this kind of vague understanding, but it always seemed to be like, well, what did they do? And I think somehow George Floyd opened the door. So that bearing witness is not passive at all. It takes a lot of capacity to be able to handle that degree of anguish. And as Shannon said, not totally freak out and lose it on people. That's really where inside it's cooking like that. And so that that bearing witness is what is needed in order for people to see how difficult it is.
Shannon, did you want to add to that?
I mean, I think it's just an interesting place for me to kind of linger because, you know, before I was a Buddhist, I was an artist and writer. And for me, it's like, I always say, you know, I don't know what you're doing in art and writing if you're not telling the truth. I don't know why you're doing it, you know? But the problem is the truth is not convenient. It never has been, and it never will be, particularly for societies, which is part of the reason why artists tend to be so reviled by any society that we're in. And so, I mean, James Baldwin said this a long time ago, you know, he said, you know, Black people need witnesses. That's what we need. And for some reason, with these videos now coming out, you know, Will Smith has that great quote. It's not that there's more racism right now. It's just that it's being filmed. Which I think is true. You know, I mean, you talk to any Black family and I mean, the racial violence goes back generations. And, you know, people tried to tell other people in power, most of whom were white, and they didn't believe them. And so, I wish that I could be as, I don't want to say hopeful, but I don't think that, I think George Floyd is a flashpoint. I don't think it's going to, I don't feel like things are really changing. And maybe I'm misinterpreting Tuere's sort of analysis, but I don't feel as hopeful about kind of the changes in the general population and sort of people's understanding of the criminal justice system and law enforcement and kind of like, I mean, that to me, like, one thing is like law enforcement is not going to give up they're not going to give up this thing that they've had going for a long time. And I'll try to find the link and put it in the chat, but NPR, I don't know if people heard it last night, had this great piece on the history of policing in the United States. And of course, how it started with the slave patrols and then sort of like evolved into the Jim Crow South. And so when you hear that, it's just sort of like, okay, yeah, this makes sense that this is what it evolved into. So I just feel like that's going to take a lot to sort of extricate from mainstream American culture.
Okay, I'm going to start looking at questions from our viewers and try to relate to what you just said, Shannon, because somebody says something that is along those lines. But I'm going to begin with a discussion I had with Cheryl Giles and Ayo Yetunde, the editors of Black and Buddhist. I recommend that to everyone to read. And we talked about their dedication of the book to everybody. They included both victims and perpetrators, this sort of inclusive sort of approach to what was going on. And I know you're all familiar with meta practice, and one of the most difficult things for us is to include those who have caused most harm. So someone named Karsten asks, is there any role for restorative justice and non-hatred in this case? And the reason I'm asking this is that Ayo and Cheryl seem to be willing to go so far to include everyone. And so that's Karsten's question. Is there any role for restorative justice and non-hatred in this case? Anyone can take that up.
I think I'll take it up. I mean, I think there's always room for non-hate and restorative justice. You know, when I said that I didn't believe that, I believed when I first became a prosecutor, good guys, bad guys. I mean, by the time I left prosecution, I was going into prisons and teaching meditation and nonviolent communication. I mean, I had a completely different relationship with people who were accused of a crime. And mostly it's because of meta. metta isn't this kind of, let me bestow some niceness on people. It's because if you're willing to be in, if you're, I guess from my perspective, if you're willing to stay in the present moment of something, you can see, you can penetrate through some of the delusions to the truth of it. So to Shannon's point, I totally agree with her that we are stuck in a world where the policing has always been used to manage, maintain, and oppress Black and brown-skinned people, and people of color in general. But what is not the same, and it is absolutely different, and I think it's where my sense of optimism comes from, is that we did not have recordings of what happened. We did not have the kind of activism that's steeped in these recordings and the kind of widespread awareness. So we are not in the same world that allowed for the level of abuse that happened with Black and brown people in policing. That's what I think is different. I think the world. I think that's what we came face to face with Derek Chauvin. I think he thought he was in the same world he's always been in. We probably thought he was in the same world he's always been in. But somehow, at some point, the world changed. I don't know what did it. I don't know why. I don't know how. But we do not live in the same world that we lived in before. Because I think this is what I want to say. The perfect sign that I ever saw, and I'm going to tell you what the words were of the sign of a protest. And I hope it's okay to say it, but anyway, I saw this sign during this protest, huge protest in Washington, D.C., that said, huge letters, "You fucked with the wrong generation." And that's what I think we're talking about. You can't take the old racist way of being and apply it to this generation and expect the same outcome, because we're not in the same world. And so how it's going to shake out, I don't know. But I do know bearing witness is going to make a lot of difference between where we've been in the past and where we're going in the future. So that's where the optimism, I think, comes from.
That's, more along the lines of what Shannon was saying. As somebody writes, oops, I lost, oh, here it is. Someone named Ray writes, and maybe this is despair, maybe this is realism, maybe it's neither. I don't see any new norm. Without the video, Chauvin would be free. Let's not fool ourselves. So it's understandable that Ray says this, but what I'm hearing right now is balancing kind of a new reality and some hope with the understandable skepticism given history. I wonder how we hold those both, because I hear, Shannon, I think I hear you holding both. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's what we're holding. I guess let me just say this. Around the time that, I lost his name. I can't remember the senator who died, or the representative who died. Lewis, thank you. When he died, I began to hear about his life in ways I didn't know about it before. And one of the things that he used to do is get on a bus when busing was allowed, when they had all these rules that said you couldn't discriminate on busing. And so he and a friend would get on a Greyhound bus and go from the south to the north, and then another bus and go from the west to the east, or the east to the west, or wherever they did. They would get on these buses and they would sit at the front of the bus, and all these white people would get on, and there'd be all this tension and irritation. And you're riding on a bus through really small places. In that moment in time, could they say, because the law changed and said you should be able to ride anywhere on the bus that you wanted, did they feel like everything was changing in their world? I don't know. I think they were probably just scared and bold as they could be. But I, some years later, can get on a bus and ride everywhere, and I don't have that fear. But the point that I'm making is that, yes, I can't tell you that we have reached the change in the place, but we are not living in the same world. I don't know how to articulate it, but I just know we are not living in the same world. Just listening to that Chauvin trial, we are not living in the same world. And I've been a prosecutor a long time. We are not living in the same world. So I don't know how it's going to shake out, and I don't know when it'll be noticeable, but it will be noticeable.
Okay, I have another question from this one from Maki. Maki writes, I am not in the legal profession, but I participate in an anti-racist group at work. As BIPOC, I find it tough to distinguish complaining for the sake of complaining and complaining as a way to explore constructive ways to address racism. If you have a suggestion or pointers about how to hold and channel this anguish and frustration, I would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, I think it's interesting in this moment, right? Like post George Floyd, there are all these books on anti-racism that all these folks, mostly white folks, propelled into the New York Times bestseller list last summer in the wake of George Floyd. And, you know, that's both good and bad, like everything. But, you know, now we're in this phase where all these organizations and groups, you know, want to be anti-racist, right? And which is also really complicated. And in my experience, you know, I'm a writer, but I'm also a professor at Minneapolis College. I teach writing. It's very painful. It's very painful work to be in a white dominant institution that has for generations perpetrated violence on Black and brown bodies, including my own. You know, I have a very particular story vis-a-vis my own institution. And then for folks to say that, okay, yes, we want to do anti-racism. We want to be an anti-racist institution. We want to do anti-racist training, anti-racism. James knows that, you know, I told him that, you know, and everyone else said that, you know, I'm blunt. It's one of my it's one of my greatest assets and one of my greatest liabilities in this life, and it's just the way it is. But you know, I came across this tweet recently where this gentleman who studies sort of organizational issues in higher education, he said, you know, all these organizations, they want to be anti-racist without getting rid of the racist people and racist structures within it. And that has been my experience. So as a BIPOC person in an institution, I'm first and foremost about take care of yourself first, and only get involved in things where you feel like you actually have some support. Because otherwise, like these institutions, like they exist to sort of perpetuate themselves, right? And by doing that, a lot of times they perpetuate the systems of oppression. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, Shannon. All right, the next question is rather long, but I'll read it. It says, an anonymous attendee says, I watched a presentation by Anne Gleich, she's a Buddhist scholar, yesterday discussing the topic of undoing whiteness in American Buddhist modernism, in which she pointed out that white convert Buddhist teachings tend to lean toward being apolitical, individualistic, and focus on transcendence. In my experience, white Buddhist folks suggest that Buddhism should be apolitical and not involved in external events. How do you see this becoming part of Dharma teaching as a collective practice rather than a solitary, isolated individual practice? How can white Buddhist teachers encourage their white students to include this orientation of integrating witnessing acts like these as skillful and necessary practice towards liberation? Tara, do you want to take that on?
I'll try to address pieces of that. And I agree with the sort of general assessment of how a lot of the teachings have been held in the United States for some time. And my personal experience with the practice is that it is the opposite of isolated, that it propels me in my relational and social life to really act on my sense of the importance of non-harm, compassion, and non-reactivity, including non-hatred. As someone mentioned earlier, is there a place for non-hatred here in this trial? And there is. Not only can there be a place, there has to be a place if we're Buddhists. We have to see this through the lens of actually compassion for Derek Chauvin. And so, you know, I think there are many teachers now, both white and BIPOC, who are seeing that the teachings have been held in a narrow way that actually doesn't reflect the fullness of the Dharma. And there is currently some of that shifting going on, thankfully. And I think Buddhist Justice Reporter is absolutely a part of that. An example of it is this idea of exploring even what is Buddhist justice. And so I would just hope that, you know, I can't remember the last parts of the question, but I hope this particular questioner, audience member, you know, looks into, there are many now teachings that are much, much more connected and much, much more address the connection between Buddhism and our action in the world.
Would anyone else like to speak to that, or should we move on to the next question? Up to you.
Can I just, one thing I think is different is that the Buddhism that was brought over here by many of the white teachers was based in a monastic way of practicing. So you'd go into a retreat center in a monastic way and get deeply instilled in the practice. And I think that's very important for practitioners to be able to go into a monastic type setting and practice deeply. But most of us as practitioners, we practice in lay life. And so the idea that our practice would look the same as monastic practice is not really, it's not realistic. So for lay practitioners, we're going to have to deal with, you know, reactivity, anger, too many bills, sloth and torpor. I don't want to do nothing. I mean, we got to practice with sleepiness on the cushion because I worked all day and I can't sit in the morning, so I sit at night and I can't stay awake. It's not, I think it's because, I guess I want to just leave it with this. I think it's Thich Nhat Hanh. It's the first time I ever heard it. He's a Zen practitioner, teacher. He's the one that said that the next Buddha would be a Sangha. And that makes so much sense if I think about American practice, Buddhist. Most of us are actually practicing together in Sanghas that are just in the neighborhood, down the street, now online. But we practice in Sanghas that are everyday life. We go to Sangha after work, or, you know, like some day long. That's my extended practice because I can take a Saturday off, but I can't take a week off. So I think in the long run, what we think of as Buddhism is also going to begin to change, and we're going to begin to see it more as lay practitioners begin to practice and speak towards what our practice is like.
That's
Can I
deep.
just
That's a
say,
deep quote. That is a deep quote. Thank you for saying the next Buddha will be a Sangha.
Yeah,
That's deep.
yeah.
I just want to say, just speak for one moment to make sure that we're bearing witness to our Asian heritage ancestors practicing Buddhism in the United States, who for hundreds of years at this point have practiced a Buddhism extraordinarily connected
Yeah.
to, not only that, but they were practicing Buddhism in a way that they could continue to survive as a community and continue to survive as Buddhists and continue to survive as Asians in the United States. So the idea that, somehow the practice of Buddhism is something you just do on the cushion, is sort of isolationist, only about seclusion, is not about social justice, is really a creation of a particular strand of Buddhism of much more recent origin in the United States, and doesn't match up with the lives that Asian Buddhists have experienced in the United States for a very long time.
Thank you, Tara. There are so many questions. We don't usually get this many questions, so I'm a little bit overwhelmed, and I'm really sorry to everyone whose questions I cannot answer, but I did want take one more question. And it relates to the wave of anti-Asian violence that swept the country. And I think one of you mentioned that Will Smith said the racism has always been there. Now it's just more visible. Well, it certainly did come out of the closet with Donald Trump. And I think it's fair to say that there's a direct correlation, if not causation, between what he said while in office and this hostility and violence against Asian Americans. I wonder if you could just comment on that, because it's so clear, out in the open, and frightening. There's no particular question, but if you want to comment on that, I see it as part and parcel of what we've been talking about for this hour.
Well, I'll just say I think all Buddhist practitioners, it is incumbent upon us to speak out against the discrimination against Asians, because we would not be practicing if it hadn't been for that Asian culture. And I mean, I have deep bows to all the Asian practitioners that held it together, because I am so happy that the Dhamma came my way. So as as practitioners, for us not to speak up, say something, articulate it any way that we can and bring it out, we are doing ourselves a disservice, because we owe so much to that culture. So that's what my thoughts would be.
And I would just add to that, I think, if we're honest, so many of us practitioners in the West, we don't know a lot about the sort of kinds of Buddhism that are practiced in Laotian communities and Hmong communities. These are some of the communities in the Twin Cities that I know Buddhism is practiced. We just, Japanese American communities, Chinese American communities, we don't know a lot of that history. And it's not because it's not there, it's because of racism. Right? And so I just think that yes. So I agree with Tuere that, we have to step up, we have to witness and say something and do something, and support our friends and loved ones when these horrific things happen. But also I think it's also a lot more than that. I do feel like Western Buddhism, I'm not going to say is heading towards a reckoning, but there's a lot of stuff that I feel like has been kind of swept under the rug that we need to deal with, vis-a-vis kind of taking some of the cultural, spiritual food is another thing, right? Like I love my Vietnamese food, but how many Vietnamese friends do I have? There's just like all this stuff like that I just feel like we need to be honest about and deal with.
Well, in the new issue of Tricycle, there's a great article by Ken Tanaka about the diversity of Buddhism in this country that's been here all along. So I suggest you look at that too. It's a great piece by Ken Tanaka, and there's also a podcast for the issue that includes a writer whose origins are in Laos, and also Ken Tanaka himself. But we're out of time, and I want to thank our panelists. It's so gracious of you to give us your time, and I'd like to thank our viewers because you had an abundance of questions. If I'd known, we would have started them earlier, but all of a sudden the Q&A platform filled up, so clearly we're reaching many people. Teware Sala, Tara Moulay, Shannon Gibney, thank you so much for joining us. It was a great pleasure. And for more on Buddhist Justice Reporter's coverage of the trial, check out tricycle.org/BJR. And I believe that there's a BJR link in the chat field. And thank you to our viewers for joining us. May you all be happy and safe.